The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Westmore University's mathematics building as students filed into room 302 for advanced calculus. Andre Taylor slipped quietly through the door with just 2 minutes to spare, his backpack heavy with textbooks and his eyes heavy from lack of sleep. The night shift at the campus coffee shop had run late, and he'd barely had time to shower before rushing across campus. Andre chose a seat in the back row, partly to avoid drawing attention and partly because it gave him a clear view of the entire blackboard. He pulled out his notebook, not the standard spiral-bound type most students carried, but a hardcover composition book filled with his own notes, equations, and theories. Some pages contained elegant proofs he'd worked out by himself. Others held questions he hoped to answer someday. The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Richard Bennett entered. He was tall and thin with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual frown that seemed carved into his face after 20 years of teaching. Without greeting the class, he placed his leather briefcase on the desk and surveyed the 73 students before him. "Welcome to advanced calculus," he said, his voice carrying clearly without any apparent effort. "I don't believe in coddling students with review sessions or participation points. You're here because you supposedly understand basic calculus. Whether you actually do remains to be seen." A nervous laugh rippled through the room. Professor Bennett didn't smile. "2/3 of you will drop this class before midterms. Of those who remain, perhaps a dozen will earn higher than a C. I've been teaching this course for 15 years, and I've never given more than 3 A's in a single semester." His eyes scanned the room. "Consider yourselves warned." Andre straightened in his seat. He needed an A. His partial scholarship covered only 60% of his tuition, and his grades determined whether he kept even that much. Unlike many students at Westmore, he couldn't fall back on family money if he failed. Professor Bennett turned to the blackboard and began writing equations, his chalk strokes precise and confident. Andre watched intently, his mind racing ahead of the professor's explanation. He'd taught himself calculus at 14 using discarded textbooks from the high school where his mother worked as a janitor. Mathematics had always made sense to him in a way that little else did, like a language he somehow already knew how to speak. 20 minutes into the lecture, Andre noticed something odd in the professor's work. As Bennett expanded a particularly complex equation, he made a small error in the third step. Most students wouldn't catch it. The mistake was subtle, but it would lead to an incorrect conclusion if left uncorrected. Andre hesitated. He was a freshman, new to university life and its unwritten rules. Drawing attention to himself on the first day, especially to correct a professor, seemed risky, but the error bothered him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Slowly, he raised his hand. Professor Bennett continued writing for several seconds before glancing over his shoulder with obvious irritation. His eyes narrowed when he spotted Andre's raised hand in the back row. "Yes?" he said, chalk poised mid-equation. "I think there might be a small error in the third step," Andre said, his voice quieter than he intended. He cleared his throat and tried again. "The coefficient should be negative when you apply the chain rule there." The professor's eyebrows rose slightly. He turned to examine his work, studying the equation for a long moment. "The classroom was completely silent. "And your name is?" he asked without turning around. "Andre Taylor, sir." Professor Bennett turned slowly, fixing Andre with a cold stare. "Mr. Taylor believes he's found an error in my work," he announced to the class. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others turned to look at Andre with expressions ranging from curiosity to second-hand embarrassment. The professor returned to the board, studying the equation. Andre knew he was right. The mistake was mathematical fact. Not opinion, but the growing silence made him doubt himself for a moment. "Perhaps," Professor Bennett finally said, "you should master basic algebra before questioning my calculus." "Mr. Taylor." A few students laughed nervously. Andre felt heat rising in his face but kept his expression neutral. He'd faced worse than this growing up in South Chicago. "The equation is correct as written," Bennett continued, though Andre could see him subtly changing the sign as he spoke. "If you're confused by standard notation, office hours are posted on the syllabus." Andre said nothing. He'd seen the professor make the correction while denying the error existed. It was a power move, pure and simple. He'd encountered teachers like Bennett before, educators who saw their role as gatekeepers rather than guides. The lecture continued. Andre took detailed notes, asking no further questions despite noticing 2 more minor errors that the professor corrected himself before anyone could point them out. When class ended, students rushed for the door, many already discussing dropping the course. Mr. Taylor. Andre had just shouldered his backpack when he heard the professor's voice. He turned to find Bennett watching him from the desk. "A word, please." The few remaining students glanced at Andre with sympathy as they left. Soon the room was empty except for the 2 of them. "Where did you complete your high school mathematics?" Bennett asked, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. "Douglas Academy in Chicago, sir." "Public school?" "Yes, sir." "And they taught multivariate calculus at this Douglas Academy?" Andre hesitated. "No, sir. I studied that independently." "Independently," Bennett repeated as if the word itself was suspect. "How interesting." Andre remained silent, unsure what response was expected. The professor studied him for an uncomfortable moment. "You know, Mr. Taylor, enthusiasm is commendable, but it's a disservice to your classmates when you interrupt with unnecessary comments. It disrupts the flow of the lecture." "I apologize if I was disruptive," Andre said carefully. "I thought the correction might be helpful." "Let me be direct," Bennett said, placing his chalk in its tray with methodical precision. "I've been teaching calculus since before you were born. I have 2 PhDs and 14 published papers on advanced mathematical theory. I don't require corrections from first-year students, especially those from non-traditional backgrounds." The implication hung in the air between them. Andre felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the feeling that came whenever someone decided who he was before knowing him. "I understand," he said, though he didn't, not really. "Good. I'm glad we had this chat." Bennett closed his briefcase. "And Mr. Taylor, I review the scholarship student list each semester. I'd hate to see someone lose their funding over attendance issues or performance concerns. I notice things like arriving just before the bell. Plan accordingly." The threat was thinly veiled. Andre nodded once, turned, and left the room, his mind already calculating a new equation: how to excel in a class where the professor had decided he didn't belong. Outside, the September sun felt too bright after the dim lecture hall. Andre checked his watch. He had 20 minutes before his next class. He found a bench under an oak tree and opened his composition book, turning to a blank page. At the top, he wrote, "Bennett Advanced Calculus," and underlined it twice. This wasn't the first obstacle he'd faced, and it wouldn't be the last. His mother hadn't worked double shifts for 20 years for him to give up at the first sign of resistance. The path forward was clear: work harder, be smarter, and never give Bennett a legitimate reason to question his presence in that classroom. Andre began writing, not course notes this time, but a plan. He would read 2 chapters ahead in the textbook. He would solve every optional problem. He would arrive 10 minutes early to every lecture. And most importantly, he would never again raise his hand to correct Professor Bennett, at least, not until the right moment presented itself. Because what Bennett didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to discover before making his judgments, was that mathematics wasn't just a subject Andre studied. It was the language in which he thought, the lens through which he saw the world. And in that world, every problem, even Professor Richard Bennett, had a solution. Andre closed his notebook and looked up at the Gothic spires of Westmore University against the clear blue sky. One day at a time, one equation at a time, that's how he'd always moved forward. And despite what had just happened, a small smile found its way to his face. After all, the professor had made 3 errors in a single lecture. And Andre had already solved for X. 2 weeks passed in a blur of lectures, homework, and late-night shifts at the coffee shop. Andre stuck to his plan, arriving early to each class, staying late to review his notes, and working through additional problems that weren't even assigned. Dark circles formed under his eyes, but his understanding of the material remained crystal clear. Professor Bennett's class had thinned out considerably since the first day. Nearly 20 students had already dropped, leaving empty seats scattered throughout the lecture hall. Andre continued sitting in the back row, though he now positioned himself dead center to ensure the best view of the blackboard. True to his word, he hadn't raised his hand once since that first day. When Bennett posed questions to the class, Andre kept his eyes on his notebook, even when he knew the answers that his classmates struggled to provide. He'd noticed the professor rarely called on students who didn't volunteer, preferring to use their silence as evidence of their inadequacy. The fundamental theorem of calculus bridges the concepts of differentiation and integration, Bennett lectured on a rainy Thursday morning. His voice echoed against the high ceiling as he wrote out equations with practiced precision. It tells us that these operations are essentially inverses of each other. Can anyone explain why this matters? A few hesitant hands went up. Bennett called on a blonde woman in the front row. Because it means we can find the area under a curve by knowing the antiderivative, she answered, her statement lifting into a question at the end. That's the what, Ms. Chen, not the why. Bennett responded with a sigh. Anyone else? The room fell silent. Andre kept his head down, writing in his notebook while mentally formulating an answer about how the theorem revealed the deep, unexpected connection between seemingly separate mathematical concepts, how it showed the elegant unity underlying calculus. Disappointing, Bennett said after the silence stretched uncomfortably long. Let's try something simpler. He wrote a new equation on the board, a differential equation that required the use of the theorem they'd been discussing. Who can solve this? More silence. Andre continued writing, aware that Bennett was scanning the room. He could solve the problem in 3 different ways, including one approach he'd developed himself that was more efficient than the standard method. Mr. Taylor. Andre's pen stopped mid-equation. He looked up to find Bennett staring directly at him, chalk in hand, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Since you seem perpetually distracted by whatever you're writing in that notebook of yours, perhaps you'd like to solve this problem for us. The professor's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. The other students turned to look at Andre, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. He closed his notebook slowly and stood up. The board, Mr. Taylor, where we can all see your work. Andre made his way down the steps to the front of the lecture hall, aware of every eye following him. As he approached the blackboard, he saw that the problem Bennett had written wasn't from today's material at all. It was a complex differential equation with multiple variables and constraints, something they wouldn't cover until the end of the semester, if at all. It was a trap, designed to humiliate him in front of the entire class. The message was clear: stay in your place or face the consequences. Bennett handed him a piece of chalk, that small smile still on his face. Take your time, he said, though his tone suggested he expected failure, and quickly. Andre stared at the equation, his heart beating faster. He recognized the problem type, a non-linear second-order differential equation with variable coefficients. He'd worked through similar problems in his own studies, though this one had a particularly nasty twist in its structure. The classroom was completely silent as Andre raised the chalk to the board. He paused, considering his options. He could attempt to solve it using the conventional approach they would learn later in the semester, but that would involve a long, complicated process with multiple steps where he might make a small error. Or he could use his own method, faster, more elegant, but unorthodox. In that moment, staring at the white equation on the black background, Andre made his decision. He began to write. His chalk moved smoothly across the board as he set up the solution differently than any textbook would recommend. Instead of separating variables in the traditional sequence, he rearranged the entire equation first, factoring out a common term that most would overlook. This transformed the problem into something more manageable, allowing him to integrate both sides with a substitution he'd developed while working through problems on his own. 4 minutes passed in complete silence, broken only by the soft scratch of chalk against blackboard. Andre filled nearly half the board with his work, each step flowing logically into the next. When he reached the solution, he underlined it twice, then stepped back. He turned to face the class. 30 pairs of eyes stared back at him with expressions ranging from confusion to amazement. Professor Bennett stood frozen, his self-satisfied smile long gone. That's not the standard approach, Bennett finally said, his voice oddly tight. No, sir, Andre agreed. But it works, he pointed to his final line. You can verify the solution by substituting it back into the original equation. All constraints are satisfied. Bennett stepped forward, examining Andre's work with narrowed eyes. The professor traced each step with his finger, looking for errors, for any excuse to dismiss the solution. Finding none, he turned to Andre. Where did you learn this method? The question came out sharp, almost accusatory. I didn't learn it, Andre said simply. I figured it out when I was working through some problems last year. A student in the third row let out a low whistle, quickly stifled. Bennett's face flushed. That will be all, Mr. Taylor, he said curtly. You may sit down. Andre returned to his seat, aware of the shifted atmosphere in the room. As he walked up the steps, a few students nodded at him with newfound respect. One gave him a subtle thumbs up. The professor cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the class. While Mr. Taylor's approach is unconventional, the standard method has distinct advantages in more complex scenarios. He began erasing Andre's work, replacing it with the textbook solution. But the damage was done. For the remainder of the lecture, students kept glancing back at Andre, and Bennett's usual confident tone had a brittle edge. When class ended, Andre gathered his things quickly, planning to leave before Bennett could confront him again. He was halfway to the door when he felt a tap on his shoulder. Hey, said a tall student with glasses whom Andre recognized from his dorm building. I'm Raj, that was seriously impressive. Thanks, Andre said, slightly uncomfortable with the attention. A bunch of us have a study group on Tuesdays. You should join. Raj handed him a small slip of paper with a room number written on it. We could really use someone who understands this stuff. Before Andre could respond, another student approached. Do you tutor? She asked. Because I'm drowning in this class, and clearly you get it. By the time Andre made it out of the lecture hall, 3 more students had asked for his help. He stood in the hallway, slightly dazed by the sudden shift. For 2 weeks, he'd been nearly invisible, and now people were looking at him like he had answers they needed. From the corner of his eye, he saw Professor Bennett watching from the classroom doorway. Their eyes met briefly, and Andre saw something new in the professor's gaze. Not respect, no, it was too soon for that, but wariness. Bennett no longer saw him as just another student to dismiss. He'd become a problem to solve. Andre tucked the study group information into his pocket and headed for his next class. The challenge wasn't over, in fact, it had just begun. Bennett wouldn't take today's display lightly. If anything, the professor would scrutinize him more closely now, looking for weaknesses, for proof that today had been a fluke. But for the first time since arriving at Westmore, Andre felt something shift inside him. He'd spent years hiding his abilities, making himself smaller to avoid standing out. Today he'd shown a small fraction of what he could really do, and it felt good. As he walked across the quad, rain pattering softly on his jacket, Andre made a new calculation. Maybe the best defense wasn't invisibility. Maybe it was brilliance, his own kind, on his own terms. He smiled as he pulled out his notebook, already thinking about next week's class and what Professor Bennett might try next. Whatever it was, he'd be ready. Word traveled fast at Westmore University. By the following week, the story of what happened in Professor Bennett's advanced calculus class had spread throughout the mathematics department. Some versions were wildly exaggerated, claiming Andre had corrected a decade-old error in a famous theorem or solved an equation the professor himself couldn't tackle. But the core truth remained. A freshman had solved a complex differential equation using a method he'd created himself. Andre found himself in an uncomfortable spotlight. Students he'd never spoken to nodded at him in the dining hall. A sophomore stopped him outside the library to ask if he was that math guy. Even his manager at the coffee shop had heard something about it, though she seemed more concerned with whether he could still handle the Tuesday night shift than with his mathematical abilities. You're becoming a campus celebrity, Raj joked as they walked to the Tuesday study group that Andre had reluctantly agreed to join. I'd rather not be, Andre replied, shifting his backpack to his other shoulder. I came here to learn, not to stand out. Too late for that, Raj said. Besides, half the class is struggling and you actually understand this stuff. Sharing knowledge is a good thing. The study group met in a small classroom in the science building. When Andre walked in, 8 students looked up simultaneously. He recognized most of them from Bennett's class, though a few were from other sections. Our math star arrives, said a student Andre knew as Luis. Unlike the others, his tone wasn't admiring. It had a sharp edge to it. I'm just here to study like everyone else, Andre said, taking an empty seat. I still have a lot to learn. Right, Luis said, rolling his eyes. Maybe you can share your secret method for solving impossible equations. The tension in the room thickened, but Raj stepped in. Let's get started. We've got the midterm coming up in 3 weeks, and I, for one, am nowhere near ready. The group settled into a productive session. Despite his initial discomfort, Andre found himself enjoying the collaborative environment. He helped explain concepts that others found confusing, breaking down complex ideas into simpler components. In return, he gained new perspectives on approaching certain problems. "You explain things better than Bennett," one student commented after Andre had walked through a particularly tricky integration technique. "He just assumes we should get it immediately." "I had to figure most of this out on my own," Andre explained. "So I remember the parts that are hard to grasp at first." By the end of the 2-hour session, even Luis had grudgingly asked Andre for help with a problem. As they packed up their materials, several students thanked him. "Same time next week?" Raj asked the group. Everyone nodded, including Andre. Despite his reservations, he had to admit that the study group was beneficial, not just for the others, but for him too. Teaching forced him to articulate concepts he understood intuitively, giving him a clearer grasp of the underlying principles. As Andre left the science building, he noticed the lights were still on in many faculty offices. He checked his watch, almost 9 p.m. His shift at the coffee shop started at 10, giving him just enough time to drop off his books at his dorm and grab dinner. He was halfway across the quad when a voice called out to him. "Mr. Taylor." Andre turned to see Professor Bennett emerging from the mathematics department building, his briefcase in hand and a folder tucked under his arm. "Professor?" Andre acknowledged with a nod, bracing himself for whatever was coming. Bennett approached, his face unreadable in the dim light of the campus lamps. "I've been reviewing your work from last week's assignment," he said without preamble. "You made several unusual choices in your solutions." Andre waited, saying nothing. "Your approach to problem 4 in particular," Bennett continued. "It's not found in any textbook I'm familiar with. Where did you learn it?" "I didn't, sir. Like I mentioned in class, sometimes I find different ways to solve problems." Bennett's eyes narrowed. "I've been teaching for 20 years, Mr. Taylor. In my experience, students don't simply find different ways to solve advanced mathematical problems without guidance." "I've always approached math this way," Andre said, keeping his voice even. "It just makes sense to me." "Indeed." Bennett's tone suggested he believed otherwise. "I've taken the liberty of contacting your high school. Douglas Academy, wasn't it? I spoke with their mathematics department head today." Andre felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "May I ask why, sir?" "Professional curiosity." Bennett adjusted his glasses. "Imagine my surprise when I learned they don't offer AP Calculus. In fact, their most advanced course is pre-calculus, and according to their records, you never even took that." Andre's jaw tightened. "I studied independently, as I mentioned before." "So you've said." Bennett tapped the folder under his arm. "You've been assigned extra problems for Thursday's class. More challenging ones. I'd like to see these independent methods of yours in more detail." He handed Andre a sealed envelope from his pocket. "This isn't required for the other students?" Andre asked, already knowing the answer. "Consider it an opportunity to demonstrate your special talents, Mr. Taylor." Bennett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Unless, of course, you find it too challenging." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Andre standing alone in the dark quad, the envelope heavy in his hand. The next day, Andre spent his lunch break in the library, working through Bennett's extra problems. As he suspected, they were far beyond the scope of their class, the kind of questions typically given to graduate students. The professor was testing him, looking for proof that Andre's performance had been a fluke or, worse, evidence of cheating. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice someone standing beside his table until they cleared their throat. Andre looked up to find a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair watching him with interest. "Those are some serious equations you're working on," she said, gesturing to his notebook. "Not typical undergraduate material." Andre quickly closed his notebook. "Just some extra practice," he said. "I'm Dr. Elena Cortez," she said, extending her hand. "Chair of the mathematics department." Andre shook her hand, surprised. "Andre Taylor, first-year student." "I know who you are, Mr. Taylor." She smiled warmly. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" Before Andre could respond, she pulled out a chair and sat down. "I've been hearing interesting things about you from both students and faculty." Andre shifted uncomfortably. I'm just trying to keep up with the coursework, ma'am. Is that what you call this? Dr. Cortez gently tapped his closed notebook. Because what I glimpsed looked more like Professor Nishimura's graduate seminar on differential topology. Caught off guard, Andre didn't know how to respond. May I? She asked, gesturing to his notebook. After a moment's hesitation, Andre slid it toward her. Dr. Cortez flipped through the pages, her eyebrows rising higher with each turn. She paused at a section where Andre had been working on a problem involving manifolds, a concept typically introduced in advanced graduate courses. This is remarkable work, she said finally, closing the notebook. And if I'm not mistaken, this approach here, she tapped a page, is entirely original. Andre nodded slightly. I've been working on it for a few months. It's still rough. Where did you learn all this? She asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. These concepts aren't taught at the undergraduate level, let alone in high school. Andre hesitated, then decided on honesty. Library books, mostly. My mom worked as a custodian at my high school. I used to wait for her after classes, so I spent a lot of time in the library. They had some old college textbooks that no one ever checked out. And you taught yourself higher mathematics from discarded textbooks? Dr. Cortez sounded impressed rather than skeptical. Math makes sense to me, Andre said simply. Always has. Dr. Cortez studied him for a moment. I understand Professor Bennett has assigned you additional work, so she knew about that. Andre nodded. Richard can be traditional in his approach to education, she said diplomatically. He believes in rigorous testing of ability. He thinks I'm cheating, Andre said bluntly. Dr. Cortez didn't deny it. What he thinks doesn't matter if your work speaks for itself. She gestured to the notebook. And based on what I've seen, yours certainly does. She reached into her bag and pulled out a book, a worn hardcover with the title, Topological Approaches to Quantum Field Theory. This might interest you, she said, sliding it across the table. Chapter 7 relates to what you're working on in those notes. My office is room 342 in the math building if you'd like to discuss it sometime. Andre took the book, surprised by the gesture. Thank you, Dr. Cortez. Thank me by continuing to do exceptional work, Mr. Taylor. She stood up. Oh, and one more thing. The department is hosting a mathematics competition next month. Undergraduate and graduate students are both eligible to participate. You might consider entering. With that, she left, leaving Andre with the book and a lot to think about. That evening, as he prepared for his coffee shop shift, Andre flipped through Dr. Cortez's book. It was far more advanced than anything he'd studied before, but the concepts resonated with ideas he'd been exploring independently. He found himself scribbling notes in the margins of his notebook, making connections between the author's formalized theories and his own intuitive approaches. For the first time since arriving at Westmore, Andre felt a glimmer of real hope. Dr. Cortez had seen his work and recognized its value. She hadn't questioned his background or assumed he was cheating. She'd simply acknowledged his ability and offered resources to help him develop it further. As he tucked the book carefully into his backpack, Andre made a decision. He would enter the mathematics competition, and when he did, he would show Professor Bennett and everyone else at Westmore exactly what he was capable of. The weeks leading up to the mathematics competition flew by in a blur of classes, study sessions, and late-night shifts. Andre divided his time between completing Bennett's increasingly difficult extra assignments, leading the Tuesday study group, which had now doubled in size, and preparing for the competition. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. More than once, Raj found him passed out at his desk, his face pressed against open textbooks, pencil still in hand. You're going to burn out, Raj warned one morning, shaking Andre awake 10 minutes before his first class. No competition is worth this. Andre rubbed his eyes, disoriented. It's not just about the competition, he said, his voice rough from exhaustion. Bennett's still looking for a reason to fail me. If I slip up even once on his assignments. That's borderline harassment, Raj said, handing Andre a cup of coffee from the dining hall. You should report him to Dr. Cortez. Andre shook his head. I need to handle this myself. If I run to the department chair, it just proves what he thinks, that I don't belong here. Despite the punishing schedule, Andre found genuine joy in the hours he spent exploring the concepts in Dr. Cortez's book. He'd taken to visiting her office weekly, their discussions ranging from established mathematical theories to Andre's own developing ideas. Unlike Bennett, she never questioned his background or doubted his abilities. Instead, she challenged him intellectually, pushing him to refine his approaches and formalize his methods. The competition will have 3 rounds, Dr. Cortez explained during one of their meetings. The first 2 are standard problem sets, difficult but straightforward. The final round is where things get interesting. How so? Andre asked, curious. The committee selects an unsolved problem, something that stumped mathematicians for years. Students aren't expected to solve it completely, just to demonstrate creative approaches. She smiled. It's a chance to show original thinking rather than just computational skill. The day of the competition arrived with a light dusting of early November snow. Andre had managed 4 hours of sleep, which felt luxurious compared to recent days. He dressed carefully in his best clothes, dark jeans and a navy button-down shirt his mother had insisted on buying him before he left for college. For special occasions, she'd said. This qualified. The competition was held in Hamilton Hall, the oldest building on campus. Participants and spectators gathered in the grand lecture hall, with its tiered seating and ornate wood paneling. Andre was surprised by the turnout. Nearly 100 students had come to watch, along with most of the mathematics faculty. Professor Bennett stood at the front of the room with 2 other professors, organizing papers at the judges' table. He looked up as Andre entered, his expression hardening momentarily before he returned to his task. 24 students had registered to compete, mostly juniors and seniors with a few ambitious sophomores. Andre was the only freshman. The competitors were directed to individual desks arranged in a semicircle facing the judges' table. Dr. Cortez stepped to the podium. Welcome to Westmore University's annual mathematics competition, she announced. We have an impressive group of competitors this year. Her eyes found Andre in the crowd and she gave him a slight nod of encouragement. The first round began. Competitors had 45 minutes to solve 5 problems covering various areas of mathematics. Andre worked steadily, finding the problems challenging but manageable. When time was called, he felt confident in his solutions. A short break followed while the judges reviewed the first round. Students who had been eliminated were free to join the audience for the remaining rounds. Andre spotted Raj in the back row, giving him a thumbs up. First round results, announced one of the judges. He read off 12 names, including Andre's. These students will advance to round 2. The second round was noticeably more difficult. The problems required not just technical skill, but creative thinking. Andre found himself drawing on techniques he'd developed while working through Dr. Cortez's book. When time was called, he wasn't certain about 2 of his solutions, but he'd given his best effort. The judges took longer this time. Andre watched as Professor Bennett argued with another judge over a paper. His paper, he realized, recognizing his handwriting from across the room. Bennett's face was flushed, his finger jabbing at something on the page while the other judge shook his head. Finally, Dr. Cortez stepped in, reviewing the paper herself. Whatever she said seemed to settle the matter, though Bennett looked far from pleased. Second round results, announced the third judge. The following 5 students will advance to the final round. Andre's name was called forth. The atmosphere in the hall changed as the final round was explained. The remaining competitors would each approach a problem that had stumped mathematicians for years, a theoretical question about the properties of prime numbers and their distribution. Patterns, you have 1 hour, Dr. Cortez explained. We don't expect a complete solution. Your goal is to demonstrate innovative approaches to this challenge. Fresh paper was distributed. Andre stared at the problem statement, letting it sink in. This wasn't like anything he'd encountered in textbooks. It was a genuine mathematical mystery, a question about why prime numbers appeared in certain patterns and not others, with implications for everything from cryptography to quantum physics. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking. When he opened them, he began to write. The approach came to him almost intuitively, a way of visualizing prime distributions as a 3-dimensional landscape rather than a linear sequence. He sketched diagrams, developed equations to describe the topography, and identified patterns that emerged from this perspective. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a genuinely new way to look at the problem. Time passed in a blur of concentrated work. When Dr. Cortez called time, Andre was still writing furiously, reluctant to stop when he felt close to a breakthrough. He handed in his work with a sense of both satisfaction and frustration, proud of what he'd accomplished, but aware of how much more he could have done with more time. The judges retreated to a private room to review the final submissions. The wait stretched to 45 minutes as the audience grew restless. Finally, the judges returned, their faces serious. Dr. Cortez stepped to the podium. "This year's final round has presented us with an unprecedented situation," she began. While all 5 finalists showed exceptional skill, one submission stands out not merely for its technical proficiency, but for its originality, she continued. The judging panel is divided on how to proceed. The submission in question takes an approach so novel that it has prompted discussion about whether it constitutes a significant step towards solving the underlying problem. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Andre felt a chill run down his spine as he realized she was talking about his work. "Professor Bennett has raised concerns about the authenticity of this submission," Dr. Cortez said, her voice carefully neutral. "As head judge, he has requested that the student in question demonstrate their methodology by explaining their approach to the audience." All eyes turned to Professor Bennett, who stood from the judges' table. "The submission from Mr. Andre Taylor employs techniques not taught at the undergraduate level," he stated flatly. "Given certain irregularities in his academic history, I believe it's reasonable to request that he explain his work publicly. If he truly developed this approach himself, this should pose no difficulty." The challenge hung in the air. Andre felt a mix of anger and determination rise within him. Bennett was making a final attempt to discredit him, to suggest that he had plagiarized or somehow cheated. Dr. Cortez looked at Andre. "Mr. Taylor, are you willing to explain your approach to the audience? This is an unusual request, but given the circumstances..." Andre stood slowly. "I'm happy to explain my work," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. He walked to the front of the hall, taking the chalk Dr. Cortez offered him. Facing the blackboard, he began to outline his approach, starting with his visualization of prime distributions as a 3-dimensional landscape. His initial nervousness faded as he lost himself in the mathematics, explaining each step of his reasoning clearly and answering questions from the judges. Halfway through his explanation, Andre noticed that Bennett's expression had changed. The skepticism remained, but something else had crept in, a reluctant recognition. By the time Andre finished, even Bennett seemed unable to deny the originality of the work. "The approach Mr. Taylor has outlined," Dr. Cortez said, stepping forward, "represents a genuinely novel perspective on this problem. While not a complete solution, it opens new avenues for exploration that our faculty had not considered." She turned to face the audience. "It is the unanimous decision of the judges that first place in this year's competition be awarded to Andre Taylor." The audience erupted in applause. Andre stood stunned as Dr. Cortez handed him a certificate and a small trophy. As the clapping continued, he caught sight of Professor Bennett. The professor's face was unreadable as he gathered his papers and quietly left the hall without offering congratulations. Andre had won the battle, but as he watched Bennett's retreating back, he wondered if the war was truly over. News of Andre's victory at the mathematics competition spread quickly across campus. His inbox filled with congratulatory messages from classmates and even a few professors. Dr. Cortez had submitted his paper to a prestigious mathematical journal, saying his approach to the prime number problem deserved wider attention. Suddenly, the freshman who had tried so hard to stay invisible found himself reluctantly in the spotlight. "You're famous now," Raj teased as they walked to breakfast the Monday after the competition. "I'm friends with a math celebrity." Andre shook his head. "I just want to focus on my classes. The semester's not over yet." That was true, but things had shifted. Students who had never spoken to him now greeted him by name. His Tuesday study group had grown so large they had to request a bigger room. And most surprising of all, Bennett's extra assignments had mysteriously stopped. But the professor himself remained a problem. Though he no longer openly challenged Andre's abilities, Bennett had become coldly professional in class, acknowledging Andre's contributions with curt nods before moving on. His grading of Andre's regular assignments became ruthlessly precise, deducting points for the smallest infractions while overlooking similar issues in other students' work. He's still trying to fail you, Raj observed, looking over Andre's latest graded problem set. These deductions are ridiculous. But they're technically correct, Andre sighed. That's the problem. He's following the rules while breaking their spirit. The situation might have continued this way through the end of the semester, if not for what happened in early December. Just before finals week, Andre was working his usual late shift at the campus coffee shop. Business was slow. Most students were holed up in their dorms or the library preparing for exams. He was wiping down the espresso machine when the door chimed. He looked up to see the university president, Dr. Phillips, enter with two people he didn't recognize. They chose a table in the corner and began what appeared to be a serious discussion. Andre took their orders, 3 black coffees, and tried to make himself inconspicuous as he worked. He couldn't help overhearing fragments of their conversation. Third complaint this semester, one visitor was saying. The pattern is concerning. We need to be absolutely certain before we proceed, Dr. Phillips replied. The accusations are serious. Andre set their coffees on the table and was turning to leave when Dr. Phillips called his name. You're Andre Taylor, aren't you? The winner of the mathematics competition? Andre nodded, surprised to be recognized by the university president. I was very impressed by your work, Dr. Phillips said. Dr. Cortez speaks highly of you. Thank you, sir, Andre replied, unsure what else to say. The president gestured to his companions. This is Ms. Washington from our Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and Mr. Chen from Student Affairs. They're conducting a review of certain departmental practices. Andre nodded politely, still confused about why they were telling him this. We understand you're in Professor Bennett's advanced calculus course, Ms. Washington said. Her tone was professional but gentle. We'd value your perspective on his teaching methods. Andre froze. I'm not sure what you mean. We've received several complaints about Professor Bennett's treatment of certain students, Mr. Chen explained. Specifically, allegations that he holds minority students to different standards than their peers. The coffee pot in Andre's hand suddenly felt very heavy. He set it down carefully. We're not asking you to make any formal complaint, Ms. Washington clarified. But if you've observed or experienced anything relevant, we'd appreciate your insights. Andre looked between their faces, thinking quickly. He thought about Bennett's extra assignments, the public challenges, the scrutiny of his background, the harsh grading. He thought about his mother working double shifts to help pay for his education, about the kids from his neighborhood who never got the chance to attend a university like Westmore. I have a break in 10 minutes, he said finally. If you're still here, we can talk then. They were. For the next half hour, Andre carefully recounted his experiences with Professor Bennett. He stuck to facts, avoiding interpretation or accusation. He showed them his graded assignments with their unusually harsh markings, described the extra work he'd been assigned, and explained how Bennett had investigated his high school background. Thank you for your candor, Dr. Phillips said when Andre finished. This information will be kept confidential while our review continues. The next week passed in a blur of final exams and end-of-semester projects. Andre threw himself into his studies, trying not to think about his conversation with the administration. He had done what felt right, but he worried about the consequences. The last day of the semester arrived. Bennett's final exam was scheduled for 2 p.m. Andre arrived early, as had become his habit, and took his usual seat in the back row. As students filed in, a murmur of confusion spread through the room. Professor Bennett was nowhere to be seen. At precisely 2 p.m., Dr. Cortez entered instead, carrying a stack of exam papers. Good afternoon, she announced. I'll be proctoring today's examination. Professor Bennett is on administrative leave pending a departmental review. Whispers erupted throughout the room. Dr. Cortez raised a hand for quiet. This development has no bearing on your examination. You will be evaluated fairly on the material you've studied this semester. Her eyes met Andre's briefly. All of you deserve that much. The exam itself was challenging but fair. Andre worked through it methodically, finishing with 15 minutes to spare. As he handed in his paper, Dr. Cortez asked him to stop by her office the following day. When Andre arrived at her office the next morning, Dr. Cortez was reviewing end-of-semester evaluations. Andre, thank you for coming. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. I wanted to discuss your plans for next semester. Andre sat down, still uncertain about why he'd been called in. I'm registered for the standard sophomore mathematics sequence, he said. Dr. Cortez shook her head. That would be a waste of your talents. She slid a paper across her desk. I'm offering you a place in our department's accelerated program. It would allow you to take graduate-level courses while completing your undergraduate requirements. Andre stared at the document, stunned. I don't understand. Is this because of what happened with Professor Bennett? This is because of your exceptional mathematical ability, Dr. Cortez said firmly. Your work in the competition demonstrated a level of insight rarely seen in undergraduate students. We would be failing in our mission as educators if we didn't nurture that talent. She leaned forward. As for Professor Bennett, the university is conducting a thorough review of his teaching practices. Several other students have come forward with experiences similar to yours. The administration is taking these concerns very seriously. Andre nodded slowly, processing everything. And my scholarship will be upgraded to a full academic scholarship, Dr. Cortez smiled. No more late nights at the coffee shop unless you want the experience. The weight that had pressed on Andre's shoulders since his first day at Westmore suddenly lifted. He had come to the university feeling like an outsider, someone who had to constantly prove his right to be there. For the first time, he felt truly seen for his abilities rather than judged for his background. There's one more thing, Dr. Cortez added. The university is launching a weekend mathematics program for high school students from underserved schools. We'd like you to help develop and teach it. Me? Andre was surprised. I'm just a freshman. A freshman who understands better than most what these students need, Dr. Cortez said. You know what it's like to have mathematical talent without access to proper resources. You can be the mentor you never had. As Andre left Dr. Cortez's office that day, spring acceptance letter in hand, he thought about all that had happened since that first calculus class in September. He had arrived at Westmore hoping only to survive, to keep his head down and get his degree without drawing attention. Instead, he had found his voice, his confidence, and a way to help others like himself. The following September, Andre stood at the front of a classroom in the mathematics building, watching as 20 high school students filed in for the first session of the weekend program. They looked like he had felt a year ago, nervous, uncertain, wondering if they belonged. Welcome, he said when they had all found seats. My name is Andre Taylor, and I'm going to be your instructor this semester. He picked up a piece of chalk and turned to the board. Let's start with a problem, he said, writing out an equation. Don't worry if it looks difficult. I believe every one of you has the capacity to solve it. As he began the lesson, Andre caught sight of a familiar figure pausing in the doorway. Dr. Cortez smiled and gave him a small nod before continuing down the hall. Andre turned back to his students. Mathematics isn't about where you come from, he told them. It's about how you think. And each of you thinks in a way no one else does. That's not a weakness, it's your greatest strength. As he spoke, he saw something he recognized in their eyes. The same spark he had felt when he first discovered the beauty of mathematics in those discarded textbooks years ago, and he knew that for at least one of these students, this class might be the beginning of their own unexpected journey.